Some people see history as a predictable progression, whereby certain events or movements are inevitable. And in this view, they see the Axis powers of the Second World War as an obvious alliance. They say, of course Germany, Italy and Japan were going to align, they were all on the same page, they were all drawn together by their ultra-nationalist and racist ideologies. They all despised the communists and thus were reactionaries, who were united in their hatred of the Soviet Union. Well, this begs the question, but is this really the case? Let's go through the events in order and figure this out. Oh, and by the way, as you'll see, I'm going to be leaning heavily on Ishida's book, Japan, Italy and the Road to the Tripartite Alliance. So if you want more details than I give here, this is the book you need to get. Germany, Italy and Japan all unified in the late 1860s and early 1870s, which was very late compared to many of the other powers. As a result, they felt like they were behind because they were. So they embarked on an aggressive industrialization and colonial expansionism policy. There existed a basic perception among the Axis powers that the West was eager to maintain the status quo, and the Axis deserved to be compensated by the advanced imperialist countries. This dual perception had the effect of encouraging aggressive acts of expansionism by each newly emerging imperialist power. Germany was ahead of the others since she was somewhat industrialized already, although needed to catch up with the West. For Japan and Italy though, they were primarily agricultural economies, which half the population were engaged in. Low productivity weakened the domestic markets and impoverished the farmers, so they expanded their industries and overseas territories to overcome this problem. Even still, Japan and Italy were still developing when the Great Depression hit, and Weimar Germany had its own problems in the wake of the First World War and the hyperinflationary crisis. Earnings lowered, there was mass unemployment, and the reaction by the Japanese was to use this surplus labour to conquer another nation. Japan therefore invaded Manchuria in September 1931, occupying it in the February of 1932. In terms of the Axis alliance, this is the incident that starts the ball rolling. The reaction by the League of Nations was to recommend that Manchuria become a state under Chinese sovereignty. But by the time the Lytton Commission got around to announcing this, the Japanese had consolidated their hold over Manchuria and rejected the findings, before finally leaving the League of Nations in March 1933. Sanctions did not follow, and thus the League was seen as weak. After President Roosevelt asked the nations of the world to disarm and abolish all their offensive arms in favour of world peace, Hitler said, yeah, we'll agree to this because we've got no military at this point anyway, but you've got to do it first. So go ahead, abolish all your weapons. And obviously the nations of the world didn't do it. When it became clear early in October that the Allies would insist on an interval of 8 years to bring their armaments down to Germany's level, Hitler abruptly announced on October 14th that, denied equality of rights by the other powers at Geneva, Germany was immediately withdrawing from the Disarmament Conference and from the League of Nations. In the aftermath of Hitler's failed attempt to Anschluss Austria in 1934, the Soviet Union then joined the League that autumn, which was a move that invited criticism, but nonetheless showed a few things. First, that Italy was still in the League at this point and had joined Britain and France in thwarting Germany's attempt to take Austria. Mussolini had sent 4 divisions to the Brenner Pass to deter Hitler from invading in the aftermath of the assassination of the Austrian fascist leader Dollfuss by the Nazis. At this point, Hitler hadn't yet rearmed, and the German army wasn't strong enough to take on the Italians, so he had to back down. Mussolini had saved Austria from the Anschluss. In September, Britain, France and Italy signed yet another piece of paper, a joint declaration pledging to preserve Austrian independence. And this shows that Fascist Italy and Fascist Austria were not on the same side as the German National Socialists. Unlike Hitler, Mussolini, had no real desire to conquer much of Europe. Certainly he did not want an alliance with Germany, whom he regarded as an enemy. The Soviet Union joining the League also shows that the democratic West and the fascists, not Nazis, were willing to bring the communists on board. So there was no reason to assume at this point that the enemies of Germany could be divided. That was until Mussolini made a big mistake. Being largely an agricultural nation in the middle of the Great Depression, Mussolini decided that he needed a military triumph to distract the Italian people. Given that the League had done little to stop Japan's undeclared war with China over Manchuria in September 1931, except appoint a commission, Mussolini can be forgiven for thinking that the League, dominated by Britain and France, would respond in a similar way on Ethiopia. After all, what he intended in Ethiopia, they had recently done in Morocco and Egypt. So he invaded Ethiopia in October 1935. His reasoning was fairly sound. The British and French had conquered large swathes of Africa and the rest of the world, and Mussolini thought Italy could do the same. Just like the others had argued during their conquests, he would civilize the barbarians, convert them to Christianity, and abolish slavery. The problem was that the attitude to colonization had changed in Britain and France. They had their colonies, so they didn't like it when a newcomer came along to do the same. But also, they now viewed their empires as more of a burden to them, not as a good thing. So when Mussolini invaded, they didn't like it. Ethiopia had also joined the League of Nations, so Mussolini had violated that too. There was an embargo on Italy, although crucially not an oil embargo, partly because they wanted to avoid a war, but also because there was hope by the British and French that Italy could be used against Germany. There was also talk of, and even some manoeuvres for, a possible war between Britain and Italy. Hitler reacted by sending arms to Ethiopia, again showing how fascist Italy and National Socialist Germany were not aligned at this point. The reason why was because Hitler sought an alliance with Britain at this time, a democratic power, but also hoped to slow Mussolini down enough in a drawn-out conflict to alienate him in the eyes of Britain and France. This would weaken Mussolini and maybe prevent him from protecting Austria in the event that Hitler moved to take it again. The result, though, was that Italy, Japan and Germany were now all isolated from the rest of the world. As the war in Ethiopia dragged on, Hitler gambled correctly and remilitarized the Rhineland on the 7th of March 1936. The League did nothing to retaliate. At this point, it's worth turning to China. In 1934, Italy helped construct an aircraft factory in Nanchang and supplied arms and military advice to China. Germany was also selling arms to China during the mid-1930s because they wanted to prevent her from sliding into the Soviet bloc. This shows that not only were they not aligned to each other, but Italy and Germany were also not in league with the Japanese. Yes, there was some racism against what they called the yellow race, but the Chinese were also classed as a yellow race, and they were siding with the Chinese, so clearly race wasn't the reason why they weren't helping the Japanese. What's more significant is that Hitler wanted as many allies as possible against the Soviet Union, and both Italy and Germany wanted to be in China for trade reasons, so their goals are not the same. But the one thing that the Germans and Japanese had in common was that they both despised the communist Soviet Union. So on the 25th of November 1936, Germany and Japan signed the anti-comintern pact. The Japanese also recognized the Italian conquest of Ethiopia that same month, and so we have the beginnings of a shift towards each other, although they're still miles apart at this point. Then the Second Sino-Japanese War started on the 7th of July 1937, with the United States beginning to take a more hardened stance against the Japanese at this point. Roosevelt sent a delegation to Brussels in support of the League's denunciation of Japan and called for a quarantine of the aggressor states on the 5th of October 1937. But while the US wanted to contain Japan, Britain started a policy of appeasement, which undermined the opposition against them. Germany continued to sell arms to China after the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and the Japanese were upset by this. But the Germans believed that the Japanese invasion would result in the spread of communism in China, since the Soviets were in support of China. So the Germans sent General Alexander von Volkenhausen to be the chief military advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. This move actually blocked both the Soviet and Italian influences there, again showing that the future Axis were not yet in alignment. Italy reduced her support for China after China approved of economic sanctions against Italy due to the Ethiopian War, and since Japan viewed Britain as her biggest threat and Italy was also hostile to Britain, Italy started to align themselves with Japan. The Italians attended a conference in Belgium to defend Japan's participation in China. Mussolini also visited Hitler in the September of 1937, and while nothing was agreed between the two of them at this time, it's clear that relations between the two former enemies were starting to improve, which is why Italy began negotiations to sign the anti-comintern pact in November 1937. Things get complicated at this point. Prior to the conflict, Japan wanted China to join the anti-comintern pact in order to dilute its pro-German character and possibly undermine the idea of Soviet influence in China. But when the Chinese refused, the Japanese turned on them and wanted to rewrite the pact to justify the Sino-Japanese War as being waged as an anti-communist war. The Germans refused, believing that China would be driven into the arms of the Soviet Union, which was the whole point of having the pact in the first place, to oppose the communists, not strengthen them. The Germans were split on what to do. The German Foreign Ministry, headed by von Neurath, was anti-Japanese and anti-Italian, believing that Hitler would oppose Italo-Japanese negotiations, since this went against Germany's interests. Ribbentrop had to outmaneuver both von Neurath and von Hassel, the German ambassador to Italy, in order to create the conditions for the anti-Comintern pact to be signed. As a side note, Ribbentrop confessed to Mussolini that he had failed to draw Britain into the anti-communist bloc. That's why he wanted to turn the German-Japanese anti-Comintern pact into the German-Japanese-Italian anti-Comintern pact, because Japan would be a substitute for Britain. Interestingly then, if things had worked out the way that Hitler and Ribbentrop had wanted, the war could have been waged between an alliance of Germany, Italy, China and Britain, plus maybe the United States, versus the Soviet Union and maybe Japan if they insisted on fighting China. That's a really interesting alternate history scenario if you think about it, and honestly I don't see how the Soviets would have won that one. Also, I'm not sure where France would have been in this. Maybe they would have stayed out of it, but then again, they may have decided to join the anti-communist crusade. Who knows? But yeah, this isn't a completely fantastical scenario when you consider that Britain nearly ended up going to war with the Soviets in 1940, so it's certainly something to ponder. Now, Britain was never anywhere close to aligning herself with Hitler, so I doubt she would have gone along with this. Germany and Japan were Britain's principal enemies because these two nations were direct or indirect threats to her empire, so a strong Soviet Union is actually in Britain's best interest because it undermines German and Japanese strength. Of course, I don't think the Chinese would have got involved versus the Soviets if they were fighting Japan, so Germany and Italy and Eastern Europe would have had to fight the Soviets without her. So I do think Britain would still have aligned with the Soviets in this scenario, and I think France would have gone with her. So while there was a potential for Britain to stay out of the conflict or even ally with the Germans, I think British opposition to German expansion would see her fight Germany regardless. Still, it's food for thought. Anyway, the day before Italy signed the pact, on the 5th of November 1937, Hitler conducted a meeting which was recorded in the Hossbach Memorandum. Hitler no longer had Britain on side and therefore sought to respect British interests by avoiding antagonising Britain directly. I've done a video on the Hossbach Memorandum and you can find it here. So yes, Italy joined the anti-comintern pact on the 6th of November 1937. This wasn't an alliance and there was no concrete arrangement, it was just a vague promise of cooperation against communism. However, what it did symbolise was the new alignment of the Germans, the Italians and the Japanese, and the end of their isolation. Italy has broken out of her isolation. She is in the centre of the most formidable political and military combination that has ever existed. But they still weren't fully in agreement. Racism in Germany and Italy meant that there was a distaste between them and the Japanese. Both Italy and Germany wanted to try and end the Sino-Japanese conflict and bring them both on board against the Soviets, but obviously that was wishful thinking. Mussolini withdrew Italy from the League on the 11th of December 1937, a move Germany supported since Hitler had announced his intention to liberate Austria and the Sudetenland. Interestingly, even at this point, Mussolini was worried that Germany might realign themselves with Britain and rejoin the League, which would further isolate Italy. Hitler was also concerned that if the Axis were too closely aligned at this time, it might be viewed as hostile to British interests, which would cause a conflict between Germany and Britain at a time Hitler was still hoping to get her on side. And so Hitler was actually somewhat reluctant to be part of the Axis. That's why the anti-comintern pact had no real content. But what's really intriguing is this. Britain offered colonial compensation to Germany in return for the abandonment of its expansionism in Central and Eastern Europe. This goes against the idea that Britain was just out to get Germany. No, she just didn't want Germany gaining a giant empire in Europe, something I explained in a previous video. It also shows that Hitler was wanting a war of aggression in the East. He wasn't willing to just expand elsewhere. He had his heart set on the Soviet Union, something denied by some third positionists. Germany's pro-British stance at this time actually went against both Italy and Japan, even though this was after they had all signed the anti-comintern pact. For the Germans, a weakened China benefited the Soviet Union, so they wanted an end to the conflict for that reason. This is perhaps why Hitler told the Japanese on the 1st of December 1937 that they couldn't recognise Manchukuo because they were importing iron ore and manganese from China. This trade would strengthen the Chinese and thus keep the Soviets out. Hitler explained that these were essential for building up the German military, which of course would benefit the Japanese in the long run versus the Soviets. The Italians also believed that the Japanese and Chinese should stop fighting, not just because of the Soviets, but because they could be allied against the West. So Italy, Japan and Germany are all against the Soviets, but Germany is pro-Britain at this point, while Italy and Japan are anti-Britain. And Japan hates China while the other two don't. So this is a confusing mess, and just shows how unaligned the so-called Axis were at this time. The Japanese countered Hitler's trade agreement with China by saying that if Germany recognised Manchukuo, the Japanese would supply those materials from the occupied province. Thus, Hitler did recognise Manchukuo on the 20th of February 1938. Nonetheless, Germany had supplied 282 million Reichsmarks of arms to China by this point, and it was only now that they stopped this. As the late 30s rolled on, Germany ended up coming around to the idea that the West and Britain were hostile towards them, and so the anti-comintern pact ended up evolving into an anti-comintern and anti-Western pact as well. which is why it was updated in September 1940, becoming the Tripartite Pact. Germany and Italy had also signed the Pact of Steel in May 1939, even though Mussolini was reluctant to do it. He was that worried that he actually made himself ill with stomach pains. On one occasion, Bottai found him doubled up on the floor of his office with his fists in his mouth, so bad was the pain. Ciano, Grandi, Bottai and Balbo wanted Italy to abandon the Pact of Steel, but unable to pursue effectively to his advantage anymore the policy of playing one side off against the other, Mussolini had turned to Germany. The Pact of Steel had nothing to do with a shared ideology, and now not even shared interests. So really, the Axis were not natural allies. They were initially hostile to one another, not seeing eye to eye over Austria, Ethiopia or China, and even their ideologies weren't the same. Germany was National Socialist, Italy was Fascist, and Japan was Imperial Nationalist, none of which are the same. The racism actually kept them apart since the Japanese and Italians weren't seen as Nordic Aryans. What brought them together was their incidental isolation followed by an anti-communist and anti-Western stance. They were then incidentally allied after their isolation, leading some to refer to the Axis as a hollow alliance. Really then, Britain's role in opposing the Axis was a vital factor in uniting these three nations, and the reason Britain wouldn't just allow Hitler to do what he wanted is outlined in this video. Thanks for watching, bye for now.